There's some very new, interesting polling data from Eco Research that we're going to be talking about with Frank Graves, the head of the company. And it focuses on under 35 Canadian men and women, their response to economic insecurity and change, decline in the number of jobs and so on. So welcome to the interview, Frank.
Glad to be here.
Let's talk about the sort of youth demographic in Canada. They seem to be really pessimistic about their future, not just short term, but long term as well.
Indeed, they are. And this has been happening for some time. Whether they look backwards retrospectively and say, how are you doing compared to 25 years ago, which is very gloomy and is backed by the objective data that shows that positive intergenerational mobility, people making more than their parents, has collapsed compared to what boomers experienced. The whole middle class dream has collapsed. But then when they look deeper into the future and say, well, what do you think it's going to look like a generation from now? The outlook is gloomier still, unimaginably gloomy. Actually, only 6% believe things will be better. That's obviously having a tremendously corrosive effect on confidence, and I expect it'll have damaging effects on the economy, social cohesion, and so forth. So yes, this is a phenomena which I think, and it's also not unique to Canada, although it's certainly playing out in Canada. Just to put it in context, that might be related back to the debate about immigration, is a very old society. At our centennial, a long time ago, when boomers were just coming of age or starting to, the median age in Canada was 26. It's 42 today, which puts us right up there, slightly behind Italy and Japan, but much older than pretty well all the other countries we're dealing with. That increases our dependency ratio, and it also reduces our the kind of buoyancy in the economy, because that's usually related to young Canada.
Frank, are there any regional differences in the data?
Yes, there are profound regional differences, although this fault line across generations, and I want to stress that it breaks out very differently for young men and young women, is most pronounced, and some of this sort of pessimism is most pronounced in Alberta. Alberta has become the epicenter of disinformation, polarization, and also this type of populism that we've been tracking for some time, which becomes exploited under conditions where people feel economic despair. And that's out there in spades. That economic despair, which is grounded in some reality, I'm not getting a house, I don't have a clear path to a secure retirement, is also reinforced and amplified through the prism of disinformation, which is a critically important factor as well, which makes it even worse. And that's stronger in Alberta than any other part of Canada, even though it exists throughout Canada.
Let's talk about the difference between men and women under 35. I think this is there's been a trend lately. Women are better educated. They're getting, as their salaries are as high or higher than men. Is that part of this trend?
It's certainly part of it, and those sorts of grievances, again, get amplified through the lens of social media. And the young men, for example, and not so young men under 50, but young men as well, most of them are on YouTube every day, and they're not reading or looking at legacy media. So the whole notion of a shared reality is collapsed as well. They're being fed, and it's been algorithmically driven, some of it by AI, some of it is a tool of statecraft emanating from other countries. Russia's really good at this, but it ends up with them having very different beliefs than, for example, even young women. Young women have all kinds of high levels of stress and so forth, but they're not participating to the same extent at all in this kind of social media disinformation ecosystem. That it affects them, but much less so. The incidence of young men who are highly disinformed is 4 or 5 times higher than young women.
Wow,
similarly, it's massive.
Right, that's shocking. What are some of maybe the top 3 issues where men and women really disagree?
Probably the top of the list would be issues about the role of public institutions and the role of state, the role of government. Women are much more likely to say, and by the way, it's really interesting to note that under 35 Canada, in some, is way more likely to say, you know what, I'd like a bigger government with more taxes. which is usually something that is seen as anathema by most groups. And that's really changed by a 2-to-1 margin. And it's true of both men and women, although women are stronger on this. Bring me this bigger government. So the whole notion of austerity and kind of cutting government back is something which is really falling on deaf ears from younger Canada, who says, but within younger Canada, the relative emphasis on issues like debt and deficit is much higher amongst men, particularly the disinformed portions of the spectrum. Women would put much more emphasis on things like healthcare, environment, and would be more favorably disposed to issues like immigration. So there are some huge differences across gender, which also get connected to partisan choices. The incidence of men and younger men who are voting conservative in Canada or Republican in the United States is dramatically higher than younger women. There is a path where younger women arrive at the kind of conservative destination, and it's relatively weak, and it's linked to the things like the MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, and it's also fueled by disinformation. A belief, for example, that vaccines are bad for you, or an exaggerated sense that genetically modified food is extraordinarily harmful, and so on. So yeah, there's lots of facets to how this plays out, but the differences are vivid and they're not going away.
How is this difference in generational outlook, how might it reshape Canada's political landscape?
Well, so far, it subsided to some extent in the last election. The last election, for the first time in Canadian history, or at least modern Canadian history for the last 50 years, really became a binary choice between conservatives and liberals. Yes, it was blocked, but everybody, it was something like 86 or 87% picked one of those two choices. That kind of blurred a lot of these differences we'd seen where, for example, young women were very favorably disposed to the NDP. Young men were much more favorably disposed to Mr. Poilievre. All of that kind of temporarily was suspended by this binary election. We're seeing that creeping back into the electorate again. But and also I don't think that young people are voting in the same numbers relative, like the millennials under 35 are by far now the largest cohort. They've replaced the boomers, who were the dominant cohort, demographic cohort, about 5 or 6 years ago, and that is continuing. So they are extraordinarily important. This is the biggest voting group in Canada by far, and so the degree that they're voting less than is something which probably will change, particularly as they see more of their vested interests and values wrapped up in these decisions.
What do the millennials, this under 30, under 35 cohort, what do they think is the cause of their increased economic insecurity and their pessimism?
You know what? I think the answer is that a lot of this is occluded from their vision. They don't really understand. They know they can't get a house. They know that they're not doing better than their parents, and they don't think their kids are going to do better than them. So they have all that is in mind, but it's operating, not at a day-to-day level. It's sort of a low-grade background anxiety, which produces, I think, the receptivity to disinformation and the new forms of populism that are out there today. I do think it was triggered and exacerbated by the recent pretty dramatic escalation in unemployment, which was concentrated in younger Canada, by the way. It wasn't concentrated in other parts of the demographic spectrum. And it was also something which we see in our data. It's not just that the unemployment rate's at 7.1%. We have tracked for 30 odd years. Do you think that there's a good chance you could lose your job in the next couple of years? Well, that just peaked at a 25-year high in data we were collecting as recently as last week. So this has really, I think, put some more sort of visceral anxiety into what was already a low grade, but very significant level of anxiety expressed by, like, I'm not going to move forward. I'm not going to do better. My kids aren't going to do better. And so this is not helping at all. It's making it worse.
Now, my understanding is that the division between men and women of that age is linked to social class and age. And we've talked a lot about age. But what about social class? Are we finding that women, because they're more educated salaries, that has shifted them a lot, while men seem to be, I don't know if the word is stuck, but something like that?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but yes, I think the perception of that is probably much stronger than the reality. Yes, women have relatively closed the gap. They're more likely, much more likely to get university education than they did 25 years ago. If you look at sort of the hedonic regression, which will link employment to education, they are doing better, but they have not eclipsed men. That's something that's important. The relative advantage for being a white, able-bodied male is diminished, but it's still there. And so this idea that this is somehow, the new kind of wounded class and that they're doing very poorly is not borne up by the numbers. They're doing relatively less well and considerably less well, but they're still not a cohort that's experiencing privation. I think what we're seeing is those who define themselves as working class, and the incidence of those who locate themselves as members of the middle class has been shrinking dramatically in both Canada and the United States. That working class group is far more likely to be angry, to be mistrustful, to be disinformed, and so forth, which makes this even worse.
Are we talking about a structural change in the economy here where sort of as society becomes more technological, we have, technology like AI, for instance, that threatens to displace professional workers. But are the folks in the what you call the working class, are they seeing their prospects diminished because of, changes in the economy that aren't going to reverse themselves?
Okay, let me give a kind of two-part answer. First of all, the long-term trends suggest that this collapse of shared prosperity, middle-class progress, which many of the very thoughtful experts, such as Darren Acemoglu and others, say is why nations fail, is when they move from inclusive economies to extractive economies. That's typically a harbinger that they're going to collapse. It might be interesting to note that the last time we saw hyper-concentration of wealth at the levels we're seeing in Canada and the United States, and Canada's not quite as bad, but pretty similar, was about 100 years ago in the Gilded Age. And that Gilded Age then collapsed into a global depression, not recession, under the weight of Smoot-Hawley, which was actually a series of tariffs, mercantilism, and protectionism, which was no more severe than what we're seeing rolled out in the United States today. So we might want to be mindful of that. But in the shorter term, you asked about things like, so some say that, the whole end of sort of the really vibrant periods of growth occurred really at the end of the 70s. Maybe there was another kind of spike up at the end of the last century. And it really hasn't operated at the average of 5 or 6% GDP growth that we saw in the US and Canada, which was relatively shared in this century at all. And many link that back to this hyper concentration of wealth. But if you look at, so some would argue that maybe the last industrial evolution, the internet and so forth, a bit of a bust. But when we look at AI, and I've got recent data on this, and I've been tracking this for some time, AI is not producing a sense of optimism. Quite the contrary. It's more negative. It's more negative amongst younger people who are more likely to use AI. So they don't think this is going to be a path to a sure, prosperous future. And I'm sure many of them associate it correctly with potential wage loss, but they also associate it with things like online harm, polarization, and there's a tremendous desire to have a more strenuous response to those issues. But, public are very unhappy with the way governments have responded to this on both sides of this divide.
Frank, we've talked about the difference between men and women. We've talked about the difference between the working class and professional class. How does the rural-urban split play into this?
It's not even urban-rural. We know that urban-rural is very important. And of course, Canada is vastly urbanized, 80 to 90%, depending on how we want to count it. But what we're seeing increasingly is now a suburban urban split. So a lot of people who are in the thrall of disinformation and this form of populism, which produces intense polarization and mistrust, live in the suburbs. The suburbs, in many cases, tend to be ethnically homogenous, but unlike the multi-dimensional, multi-cultural downtown cores of urban centers, it tends to be new Canadians, often living in these suburban dormitories surrounding our big cities. So that's one phenomenon. The rural is very different again as well, but we have to talk about those three different groups, but those effects are very big. One past thing we tested in interest, which came up in our most recent research, which we don't normally look at, was the role of religion and how that links to household size in these factors. And we are finding that in Canada, as in the United States, even though religiosity is somewhat lower in Canada, those who are self-identified Christians, Catholic, evangelical, are more likely, first of all, that's more likely to occur amongst larger households, but it's also much more likely to be disinformed and much more likely to be mistrustful. So anti-vax, vaccine hesitancy, suspicion or denial of climate change, all of those are much more pronounced in that group as well. So the interactions are actually quite interesting and complex, but the picture is becoming sharper. I guess what's not becoming sharper is the solutions. I guess in the long term, you're not going to put this genie back in the bottle without, restarting middle class progress. In the immediate term, you need a much more compelling and effective response to disinformation and polarization, which is happening in other countries. Like this problem doesn't exist on anything close to the scale in Finland or Sweden. They start dealing with these problems in kindergarten and inoculating people through training them on how to identify disinformation and develop critical reasoning skills. We better get around to that playbook pretty soon.
Well, on that note, Frank, let's wrap up the interview this way. Can you look out maybe 2 to 5 years and comment on the trends that you're seeing and how you expect them to develop in that time period?
It's very difficult to answer that question, and I think it's the stakes are huge, as they say. That old saw apocryphally associated with Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. We've got a lot of the factors, as I mentioned earlier, hyperconcentration of wealth, the introduction of mercantilism and protectionism, but we just come out of, or maybe haven't really come out of, a global pandemic. That was the case 100 years ago as well. War in Europe, bingo, got that too. So, as we know, that there were populist responses to both of those, to those factors. But Europe and America went in very different directions. The populist response in North America was a New Deal, which was very much populist, but involved a very bold set of policy agendas, including the creation of public high schools, minimum wage, trade unions, massive national projects like the Hoover Dam. Europe went in a very different direction with the advent of fascism and all the horrors that ensued there. So I'm not saying that we're going to see the same things playing out, but I also wouldn't discount the possibility that those kinds of major changes could lie in the future. So it's important to have this debate and understand what the choices are, because they are quite stark.
Is it important that we see in the United States that President Donald Trump, and I read a lot of American commentary on this, and the perception is from the center and the center left that Trump is dismantling the administrative state, the welfare state, and what he can't dismantle, then he's hobbling it and making it less effective. And that would seem to be the mechanism that you would use to address the issues you're talking about. So if there's no administrative state, what policy levers do you pull? And we're not quite that far along in Canada, but if we went further along, would that then give us fewer options to respond?
Yeah, that's good. That's a great question. I would emphasize, just as we've seen Trump punishing, various spokespersons who are being critical, having them fired, suing various, legacy media who are kind of obsequiously complying because he's got a big stick to wield. But we are also seeing, as you mentioned, the other factors going on. I point out one interesting difference that in Biden, for whatever that administration was going to introduce wealth taxes, and those wealth taxes were going to generate massive investments in things like new post-carbon technology and so forth. It was pretty broadly supported. It's even more strongly supported in Canada. But the numbers that was going to generate are roughly the equivalent of what you're going to get out of the tariffs. It was in the neighborhood of $5 trillion. But what it was going to do is actually potentially start to reestablish the strength of the middle class, whereas the tariffs are specifically designed to cushion the wealth tax, not the wealth tax, there is no wealth taxes, but the cap taxes on corporations and the mega wealthy. So they're really incredibly different paths. I noted that in Canada, and we don't think there's any evidence for going that direction, but the support for things like a wealth tax, which is, the modest version that had been proposed, which wouldn't actually do anything but slow down somewhat the acceleration of the centimillionaires and billionaires away from the pack. It wouldn't reverse it. It's extremely popular in Canada and much more so in younger Canada, like in the tune of 80% support. That's a great idea, but we're not talking about it. And it's kind of a bit of a paradox, because that is, according to younger Canada, who are so discontent, low-lying fruit. Why do you do that? You want to fund your national project? We love the idea of national project, particularly things like high-speed rail or redoing the hydroelectric corridor. How are you going to pay for it? Well, wealth tax would be one good way of doing it.
Frank, this has been fascinating, and we'll look forward to further conversations. Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure. Always nice to chat with you.